Hello, everybody. My name is Maureen Haan. I am the President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. I am also a Disability and Work in Canada member of the steering committee. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce and moderate this panel with you today. Joining us today, we have Eppo Maertens and we have Pamela Lefaive. Am I saying your last name pretty close? Lefaive. And they are going to speak to us today about employment strategy for Canadians with disabilities and the youth employment skills strategy. I know that this morning, or earlier today, when Minister Qualtrough joined us, she was quite excited about some pieces of the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about the details of that. So with that, I will put it over to you, Eppo. I will ask people to please think about some questions that you've got, because I believe that we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. So over to you, Eppo.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much, Maureen, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on the employment strategy for persons with disabilities. Of course, accessible and inclusive employment is a key federal priority. And the employment strategy for Canadians is a key initiative aimed to help advance that priority by helping to address some persistent and longstanding barriers to employment faced by persons with disabilities. Maybe before I go into my presentation, I'll just introduce myself. So Eppo Maertens. I work at Employment and Social Development Canada. I am very proud to have participated in, and I believe presented at every DWC conference since its inception. So very pleased to be continuing today. I'm responsible for a few programs at Employment and Social Development Canada. That includes, of course, the employment strategy for persons with disabilities that I'm speaking about today. And I also have responsibility for the Opportunities Fund for Persons with Disabilities. I think many of you are aware of that program. I'll talk a little bit about that today as well, but it's a program that funds organizations in the community nationally and locally that deliver employment and training supports to persons with disabilities, as well as supports for employers who hire persons with disabilities to help them build inclusive and accessible workplaces and hire and retain persons with disabilities. And I'll introduce as well Pam Lefaive, who is joining me as well, as Maureen mentioned, from the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy. And Pam, do you want to say a few words of introduction before I jump in?
Thanks, Eppo. Sure. So hi, everyone. As Eppo may have said, I'm Pam Lefaive. I am the director responsible for youth employment and skills strategies at Employment and Social Development Canada. We are one of the programs that will contribute to the employment strategy that Eppo will speak to shortly, and once that's done, maybe we'll come back to me and I'll go into more detail about the work that we're trying to advance with youth with disability under the programs that I'm responsible for.
Thank you, Pam. Okay, so let me start. I think the reasons for why we have an employment strategy are pretty well known. So I'll touch only briefly on them. Canadians have historically enjoyed pretty high levels of employment, a relatively equitable labor market. But as you know better than anyone, persons with disabilities haven't fully shared in that prosperity. There's a large persistent gap in employment rates. Persons with disabilities earn less than those without disabilities. More than half of persons with disabilities in low-wage entry-level jobs have completed some post-secondary education. and a really small percentage, less than 1% of small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada are actually owned by persons with disabilities. And of course, the labor market outcomes of persons with disabilities are also impacted by a range of intersecting barriers. So just to give a couple of examples, 1/3 of First Nations aged between 25 and 54 who live off reserve have a disability compared to 1/5 of the general population. Nearly half of non-employed persons with disabilities who are visible minorities with a disability have the potential for paid employment compared to just over 1/3 of their non-visible minority counterparts. And of course, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that persons with disabilities have been a lot harder hit than those without disabilities. We had a survey back in 2020, a crowdsourced survey by Stats Canada that showed that that over a third of individuals with long-term conditions or disabilities reported temporary or permanent job loss as a result of the pandemic. And I think at the same time, I mean, there's this fundamental inequity, and at the same time, persons with disabilities are a significant source of untapped labor. So based on some research done by StatsCan on the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, they estimated that some 850,000 persons with disabilities aged 15 to 64 who are not working and not currently in school actually have the potential for paid employment in an inclusive labor market. Donc, à la base, la stratégie d'emploi pour les Canadiens en situation de handicap est l'engagement du gouvernement fédéral à s'attaquer aux obstacles persistants et de longue date que rencontrent les personnes en situation de handicap sur le marché du travail. Et il s'agit d'une initiative clé du plan d'action pour l'inclusion des personnes en situation de handicap. La stratégie a été annoncée à la fin de l'année 2020, un moment unique dans l'histoire. La COVID-19 était à un stade critique. Les personnes en situation de handicap ont été sévèrement touchées par les impacts économiques de la pandémie, beaucoup plus sévèrement que les personnes non handicapées. Et l'expérience des récessions passées indiquant que les personnes en situation de handicap mettraient également plus de temps à se remettre des chocs économiques. Par conséquence, au cours des 2 dernières années, la stratégie d'emploi s'est concentrée principalement sur la diffusion d'aides indispensables pour atténuer les impacts économiques les plus immédiats de la pandémie. Okay, so some early achievements, and actually, we move to the next slide now. So some early achievements. So I've included a number of them on the list, but basically a number of investments made early on during the course of the pandemic to help persons with disabilities access skills training and employment supports during the pandemic. We invested 50 million in 2020, followed by 65 in 2021 in the Opportunities Fund, which, as I mentioned, funds skills training and employment supports for persons with disabilities. There were significant investments also made under the workforce development agreements, which is federal money that we flow to provinces and territories, a sizable chunk of which, about 1/3 of which goes specifically to training that's earmarked for persons with disabilities. There were a number of investments made through a number of other programs at ESDC, a number of which either included specific targets for funding targets for persons with disabilities, or which put an emphasis on persons with disabilities or on members of other underrepresented groups. And then most recently in budget 2022, a sizable investment of nearly 300 million over 5 years in the opportunities fund, with new projects expected to start fairly soon. A number, I guess, a significant emphasis made early on in terms of ensuring that immediate supports were available to mitigate the impacts of the COVID pandemic, and to aid in a inclusive recovery as we've come out of that. So if you go to the next slide. So the employment strategy builds on extensive research and engagement that we've done over a number of years, including prior to the pandemic. There were consultations, of course, on the Accessible Canada Act. We had a National Disability Summit in 2019. And we continued with targeted engagement during the pandemic to help us better understand the rapidly changing workplace on persons with disabilities. We engaged with a number of experts, worked with the Minister's Disability Advisory Group. We consulted with community organizations. We heard from individuals through a number of roundtables. And there was also, of course, the DEP survey, which took place in 2021. We've also been working closely with and drawing on a number of other federal initiatives, including, for example, the National Autism Strategy. And this early engagement helped us establish 3 immediate and overarching goals for the employment strategy. If you go to the next slide. So the 3 immediate goals: to help individuals with disabilities find and maintain jobs, advance in their careers, or become entrepreneurs; to support employers to recruit and retain persons with disabilities by creating inclusive and accessible workplaces; and to increase the supply, capacity, and reach of individuals and organizations that work to support disability inclusion and accessibility in employment. So this is really, these goals have really been informing a lot of the investments that we've been making over the last year and a half. For those who were involved in applying for the call for proposals, you would have seen that the call for proposals under the Opportunities Fund was very much aligned with these 3 goals. So they've really been kind of our driver as we've made those investments. So in terms of, so we can go to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about some of the early investments that were made. Other initiatives that have been made to date include the establishment of a Disability Inclusion Business Council. So we expect an announcement with more details about that imminently. But basically a 1-year ministerial advisory committee that will be CEO-led and composed of business leaders at the forefront of disability inclusion. And the idea will be to really sort of help set the example and move the bar among employers in terms of making that business case for inclusive hiring. But not only making the business case, since I do think many employers do understand the business case, but also helping them actually implement inclusive hiring practices and increase the diversity of their workplaces through hiring persons with disabilities. We're also looking beyond employment programs and want to make sure that we're looking at those various programs that, in addition to the programs that provide training or provide employment supports directly to persons with disabilities or assistance to employers, looking at those other government programs that support sustained employment, including programs around transportation, housing, childcare, etc., which can of course have a really huge impact on one's ability to find and keep a job. So the idea of the employment strategy is really finding better ways to coordinate the efforts and meet the evolving needs of persons with disabilities in all areas that contribute to employment. So you could go to the next slide. So I've talked a little bit about the Opportunities Fund already, and I've talked about the investments that we made through budget 2020. There was a call for proposals that was launched in late May, early June. The new funding, so the Opportunities Fund is a $40 million program. With the new funding provided by the budget, we go to a yearly funding envelope of 100 million a year starting next year and going on for the next number of years. And as I mentioned, the focus of the call for proposals was very much around the three goals of the employment strategy. So again, helping individuals, helping employers, and helping those who work to improve accessibility. We also included an element to support career advancement. So we've been working on this for the last year or so on the recognition that a lot of government programs are very much focused on helping persons with disabilities integrate into the labor market, find that first job, find stability in that first job. But there's a real need to do more to help advance their career once they have found stable employment. So that was very much part of the call for proposals as well. We had quite a good response to the call, about 380 proposals in total. And so the assessment and approval of those is ongoing, and we hope to have an announcement on that soon. Next slide, please. So I mentioned some of the engagement that we built upon as part of the employment strategy. I've mentioned some of the engagement that was ongoing during the pandemic period as we were delivering and implementing on new investments under the strategy. We see engagement as being an ongoing feature of the strategy, and something that will inform the employment strategy on a going forward basis. To really become an evolving set of actions that adapt on a regular basis to the emerging needs of persons with disabilities. So there's a number of engagement activities that we're currently planning. I know that Pam and her youth team have also been involved in some engagement around youth with disabilities. And we have a couple of objectives going forward of areas that we'll be doing further engagement on, and also building on some of the engagement that's been taking place throughout the department on the community-led engagement and the engagement with Indigenous peoples. All right, next slide. So going forward, there's a couple of areas that we want to now turn our attention to as we finish the implementation of the call for proposals investments that were made through budget 2022. We want to, as I mentioned, make engagement an ongoing feature of the employment strategy and get into a regular cycle of engagement with persons with lived experience, as well as organizations that support them, families, experts, other key stakeholders. We want to work towards embedding disability in all federal programming. So we, of course, have targeted programs for persons with disabilities, like the Opportunities Fund for Persons with Disabilities. We have, of course, a disability component under the workforce development agreements, but persons with disabilities are served by a whole range of different programs. I think the youth employment strategy is one great example, but there's many other programs as well, whether it's the union programs, the sectoral programs that we have, that all serve persons with disabilities. And we've got programs at other departments as well that offer various training supports for entrepreneurs, other employment supports. And one of our goals for the strategy is to create a suite of government programs, or maybe I should say to ensure that our current suite of government programs is set up to be inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. So a person with a disability doesn't necessarily get streamed into the Opportunities Fund because that's the disability program, but can access any program that best suits their needs and can find inclusive and accessible supports in that program so that they can be fully successful in it. Excuse me. So we also want to make sure that we're taking a whole of government approach. And that means, again, not only employment and skills training, but all of the various different government supports and government programs that can have an impact on the sustainability of employment. And then finally, I think we'll be developing a set of key indicators and measures so that we can measure progress of the employment strategy and our implementation over time, and be able to report back to Canadians on how successful we've been at moving the needle on employment. So I'd say maybe in a nutshell then that the idea of the employment strategy is really to become an evolving set of actions that takes a whole of government approach and is continually adapting to the emerging needs of persons with disabilities through a variety of program responses. So I think I'll leave it there and pass things on to Pam, and then I think we do all the questions after, right?
That
Well,
sounds
thank
good.
you.
Thanks. Sorry, that sounds good, Eppo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eppo. Maybe just to start off, Eppo, started his presentation with a number of stats, and what they show is that that the labor market is not always favorable to persons with disability. And this can be compounded when you start looking at youth with disabilities. In July 2021, the unemployment rate of a sample of youth with disabilities aged 15 to 24 was not about 9% points higher than the employment rate of all youth. And when we look at equity deserving youth, they're also more likely to face intersecting barriers. 17% of youth with disabilities in Canada are racialized. A higher percentage of First Nations people living off reserve MAT youth have a disability compared to non-Indigenous youth. And youth with disabilities face persistent barriers to employment and have poor labor market outcomes compared to their peers, and are more likely to not be in employment, education, or training. And I think that's where the youth employment and skill strategy really comes into play. The acronym for the strategy is YES, and it's meant to help young people age 15 to 30 gain the skills and experience they need to successfully transition into the labor market. The YES is not a program that's specific to youth with disabilities. However, the youth with disabilities is one of our priority groups of youth that we're trying to focus our efforts on. The program really has two different program streams. One is the Youth Employment and Skill Strategy Program. It is delivered by ESDC along with 11 other federal departments, agencies, and Crown corporations. And we also have the Canada Cyber Jobs Program, which is delivered solely by ESDC. And through the S, we can fund a range of activities and supports to help youth who are facing the greatest barriers to employment, or those that are underserved in the labor market. And those, we often work with third-party service providers or employers, and we can deliver. There's wage subsidies aspect to it, but it's really focused on, you know, helping youth build the skills, the tools, and get that first experience to get them in the door. If you want to go to perhaps slide 13, as part of the mandate for the Minister of Women and Gender Equality and Youth, who is the minister responsible for the S, she was mandated to create a new stream under the S to better serve youth with disabilities. The S has and will continue to serve youth with disabilities, but we really wanted to look at how we could, improve our supports, improve our programming, and maybe address some gaps in terms of how our program is implemented. And to help with this, we've started to conduct some roundtables. We had several that we did this fall. We met with service providers serving youth with disabilities. We've met with employers working with youth with disabilities. And later in December, we're going to be working with youth themselves, or meeting with youth themselves, to discuss, their challenges and needs in terms of how we can better support them transitioning into the labor market. Slide 14, this is just a really preliminary overview of some of the things we've heard with regards to our roundtable discussion from a service provider. And I think this really flows nicely into some of the pillars that Eppo was highlighting as part of the employment strategy. But service providers really spoke a lot about the need for, ensuring that the necessary skills development in primary and secondary schools. So not waiting till a youth is, approaching adulthood to get some of those, initial skills and development and tools in place to help them with, their abilities to find employment and to succeed in employment. They talked a lot about flexibilities. So, recognizing that, there's a diversity of disabilities, and really being able to provide flexibilities in terms of how our supports are provided to the individual needs of youth. They talked about the importance of subsidies, but also sometimes, the perils of subsidies in terms of maybe sidelining some of the real issues that that youth with disabilities may face. And they also mentioned, things that I think, again, was highlighted by Eppo, but some of the real tangible things that youth with disabilities face in terms of, being successful or in employment, or entering the labor market, transportation, issues around mental health concerns, just troubles in navigating the workplace accommodations and supports. And I think while, working at, in a virtual setting can be helpful, it also can be a little bit isolating as well. Employers, when we met with them, really reiterated that youth with disabilities do make strong employees, and that we need to focus more on how to support them and bring them into the labor market. And a lot of them talked about not necessarily incentivizing employers, but really focusing programming on those employers that have inclusivity as a core value in the work that they do. The other things that the employers did raise as well was that, because there's a large, diversity in terms of what is considered a disability, that more information and more supports, tools, I think, just knowing where to go to get the information that they need, um, and also looking for coaching for employers and providing ongoing support to employers on key findings, or key tools to help them be better employers when working with youth with disability. And it's those type of things that would be key to ensuring that they maintain an inclusive workspace. So we are looking forward to hearing what the youth themselves say with regards to their needs, and how programs like the YES and the Opportunities Funds, for example, could better serve them in the future. And we're looking forward to the discussion that we have today, and I look forward to hearing any thoughts around the table today about how we can improve our programming to better serve youth with disabilities in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you both very much. That I learned a lot, and so that's great because Eppo and I talk a lot. Pam and I have not yet, but now maybe Pamela will be on my speed dial as well. And so if I've learned something, I'm sure that everybody else in the room has learned as well.